In 2003, the members of Pierrot entered an abandoned hospital to film the music video for what would become their new single, No Night Morphine. What should have been a routine shoot took a dark turn the moment they arrived. The building had been repurposed as a filming studio, so the band began scouting the location, deciding where to shoot and how to bring the video to life. At first, nothing seemed unusual. Then, they reached the third floor. It had been sealed shut, hidden behind a barricade as if someone wanted to make sure no one ever entered again. Instead of leaving it alone, the band joked about coming back to investigate it after filming. That was a mistake. The moment they started recording, their audio equipment began malfunctioning in strange ways until it was completely cut out. Then, in the middle of the sudden silence, a nearby pane of glass exploded in front of them. That wasn't an accident, but rather a warning from another realm. But for them, it wasn't the first time. In Japanese folklore, music and performance are naturally tied to the spirit world. Words once spoken or sung with enough force and repetition take on a life of their own and can summon or attract spirits. That belief is something that carries through to this day, and it can be spotted in popular culture, music lyrics, and even in manga and anime. And while this applies to some extent to most Japanese performances, there is a particular subculture that always seems to be at the epicenter of paranormal phenomena. One where musicians not only invoke the power of words, but also become vessels for something bigger to step into. I'm talking about Visual Kei, a subculture that, despite being fairly modern, taps deeply into that ancient folklore. Many bands have reported all sorts of paranormal phenomena during their performances, things that can't be explained by modern science, but rather by ancient texts. And when analyzed through the lens of the past, these accounts tell very interesting tales about the spiritual inheritance of their art. So, let's dive deep into the paranormal side of Visual Kei and Japanese folklore. As I mentioned before, Pierrot always had ties with the spirit world, and had always been transparent about all of their encounters. In the year 2000, the band headed to a hospital to film another music video. This time, a relatively new one, nothing like what they would find years later. Just another routine job: get in, find the locations that best suited the storyboard, film it, and get out. At first, everything was completely normal. Just another hospital, filled with equipment and an atmosphere that suited the band's lyrics, ones that often walk the line between life and death. Until they found the nurse's station. It had been sealed off. This time, the band didn't need to joke around. Jun, the guitarist, peered through a gap to see what was inside. What he found was strange, as if someone or something had gone through the entire room, searching desperately for something. All that remained were dozens of patient files scattered across the floor. Soon after, the nurse's call system began beeping incessantly from that ward, as if someone in a patient's room was in severe distress and in dire need of help. Needless to say, the area was empty. Whatever was calling out wasn't human, or at least it wasn't anymore. But still, it kept calling for them until they finished shooting and left the building. Two hospitals, one abandoned, the other unclear. Since it was relatively new, one could think it had perhaps closed down recently. After the economic bubble burst, many places shut down suddenly. But whether recently closed or abandoned for years, There is a very interesting phenomenon at play here. In Japanese folklore, abandoned hospitals rank among the most haunted locations, as they absorb the emotional residue of suffering. Episodes of intense pain, grief, and unexpected death can leave an imprint on a place. Once too many of these episodes accumulate, the location can become a hotspot for vengeful spirits, especially those who passed away in pain or confusion. This is something deeply rooted in the concept of the Onryō, spirits born from negative emotions. While they roam the other realm, they will seize any chance of contact with the mundane world, and when they do, they seek to harm it. When it comes to a psychiatric world, as it was the case of the first story, this becomes something even more powerful, as there is a deep ritual impurity associated with madness and death in Japanese belief. And that is something most visual kei bands have woven deeply into their lore and performances. Dir and Grey is probably the band that embraced the concept of Kegare, ritual impurity, in the most intense way, and it almost cost them their career. In the early 2000s, as they wanted to strip themselves of the visual kei label and attract a more hardcore metal audience, the band changed radically. At first, they started playing with the concept of the albums as a spiritual desecration, like the album Kiso, meaning the burial of demons, those that shall not be buried. But those small rituals soon took over Kyo, their vocalist. He started by tearing open a new dimension in their performances, as he began to cover himself in blood, fake blood at first. But soon after the first performances, something took over. He would push his theatrical performances to dangerous physical extremes, utilizing real blood on stage. He even took it further. After covering himself in his own blood, he would begin to punch himself in the face. As you can imagine, this kind of behavior wouldn't go without paying at all. It didn't last long before Kyo paid a price that transcended physical pain. It all began with a period of severe psychological distress, where negative thoughts took over his mind. Why bother performing? Why bother doing anything? In his own words, his heart was being gouged out. And as if that weren't enough, his body started to fail too. It got so bad that at some point, he suffered a sudden loss of hearing, a neurological condition with no external causes. Becoming deaf meant the possible end of the band. Luckily, he recovered, but it also led him to make a terrible mistake. He doubled down, and soon he was depleted of energy. In the middle of sets, his voice would break down to the point where he couldn't sing the last songs at all. This was the most turbulent era in the band's history, a period where each time they called to the other side, it answered back and threatened to bring the whole project to an end. In terms of folklore, this story intersects and taps into many different concepts. Musicians walk the divide between the mundane and the spiritual, as music was used in the past as a way to communicate with and entertain the dead. Kyo, with his performances, attracted a certain kindred spirit. As his acts were impure, embracing death, pain and blood, they began to accumulate until he was drained of any life force. Like a spiritual septic wound, instead of healing, it started manifesting in his body. The more intense his performances became, the more evil he attracted. It is said that visual kei performers wear a mask on stage. Not a physical one, but an identity, a different name and story, makeup and an attire that spiritually transcends our world. One that always attracts from the other side what they manifest in this one, as entities step inside into that mask. This is something that can also be analyzed through the globalized lens of today, and while it may not be spooky or mystical, it's something deeply human, which can be terrifying in its own way. Many people still think that evil is the opposite of good. They are wrong. Evil is simply the absence of good. The moment one forgets to love themselves, even just a little, it can attract all sorts of forces, be it from another realm, from this one, or worse, from oneself. Not every source of strange phenomena comes from the spirit realm. Sometimes it comes from the living, and when it does, it can be dangerous. It's a story as old as time, really. The visual kei subculture, especially after its ice age and the rise of social media, has become increasingly parasocial. For a significant part of the fandom, the relationship with the musicians is one-sided and based on kinship or love, usually with a very intense fixation. Those emotions, when strong enough, can cross into the other realm and come back into this one. It is believed that extreme emotional states, particularly negative ones like jealousy and obsessive longing, can cause a living person's spirit to partially detach from their body and travel toward the object of that emotion. That is the concept of Ikiryō, the living spirit projection. And if I'm reading your mind correctly, you may think this makes it less powerful, since it's outborn in our world. But the accounts of those who have experienced it as recipients say otherwise. Some feel watched, even when they are completely alone. Others wake up in the middle of the night, only to find a physical manifestation watching over them. And when those emotions run even stronger, there have been accounts of sudden, unexplained illnesses, particularly when romantic relationships become public. Japanese esoteric practitioners often advise musicians and idols to undergo purification and cleansing rituals to clear the accumulated Ikiryō. Emotions are a powerful force, even if sometimes it feels like the world tries to drown them out publicly. They always resurface when no one's looking. You know, the first time I learned about the concept of Ikiryō, I froze for an instant. As I said, this is a story as old as time. Emotion has been behind the worst disasters and the most triumphant moments in human history. And when we bring it down to an individual level, I'm sure you have experienced too how outside forces can affect your life. Even if you hold love for yourself, if you are surrounded by people who hold negative emotions against you, you can feel them. For them, it may not even be something conscious, but as they project jealousy, hatred, or any other kind of negative feeling toward you, your life can be dragged down by it. Unusual bad luck, strange events, feeling constantly drained, that may be the cause. The opposite happens too. Your life can change when you are surrounded by good people. I don't mean saints by any means, but people who will root for you deeply, even if they don't express it publicly. I believe this is a rite of passage. As we gain enough wisdom about our environment, we often realize all we need is to find good people who root for us. However, for public figures, this is something that is out of their control, as they don't know what they will attract with their art. Imagine those forces, multiplied by a large following with unpredictable emotions behind every good action and behind every scandal. What kind of good can happen when they root for them, and what kind of evil can they attract at their worst? Makes sense, don't you think? Sometimes outside forces aren't evil, but are rather good in mysterious ways. And this happens more than we can imagine, even if most times we don't realize it. However, Jun, the guitarist of Pierrot, was able to notice it. Since childhood, he always had carried a lifelong recurring vision. He would see a clear, still image of himself standing on the Budokan stage. As a child, he was no sort of musical genius. Like most kids, he didn't hold any special talent back then, so the chances of that outcome were really thin, as you can imagine. But once one is caught into destiny, it is believed the gods associated with creativity and fate start plotting for you to succeed. From that moment on, Jun experienced what is called Michibiki, divine guidance. On many occasions, life conspired in strange ways, making him cross paths with who would become his bandmates, and eventually guiding them all until his vision became true. Pierrot became the fastest band to play Budokan since their debut. It only took them 6 months, something that, back in that day, was completely unheard of. In one account he had shared publicly, a stranger at a bar approached him and read his poem. What did he tell him? To find his companions, otherwise the path wouldn't open. Soon after, he found himself moving to Tokyo, despite all odds, to try to make it as a musician. You had never spoken to that person before, and by any logical account, the stranger had no way of knowing about his vision, as if he saw his fate rather than his reality. So tell me something, do you believe in the paranormal? Depending on your views, these stories might land and resonate differently with you. For some, these are just pieces of lore that weave the story behind bands and musicians, and when framed through the cultural lens of their past, explain what they went through to carry their vision. For others, it may go even deeper, even if they don't believe in the spirit realm, because after all, behind all of that, these are deeply human stories. Some are filled with darkness, others, like the last one, shed some light into this world. As for me, if I were to tell you these accounts years ago, they would have been just human stories. However, a few years ago, I experienced a story of my own, during the weirdest time of recent human history, 2020. It began with a phone call and a simple job offer, where the owner of the company and I had a brief talk about my potential role and what I could bring to the team. Before hanging up, the owner told me my future department head would email me to schedule my final interview. I didn't think much of it, but as I fell asleep that night, I had a very strange dream. In that dream, I was talking to a woman named Claudia over a video call. We talked about the technical side of the job and my fit within the company. When I woke up, I remember how she looked and her distinct Eastern European accent. But I didn't pay much attention to it. Maybe I was just excited about a new opportunity in life. 3 days later, I received an email with a video call link. As soon as I clicked, there she was, Claudia. She looked exactly like in my dream, and we talked about the same topics, very niche ones, as back then I was working in a very specific field that not many people in the world did. I remember going pale as a ghost. All the hair in my body stood on end and my mind was trying to process what I was seeing. Nonetheless, as in my dream, everything went perfectly. Years later, as Claudia was about to leave the company, she asked me why, in that interview alone, I had acted so nervous, strangely cold toward her. When I told her what happened, she just laughed, patted me on the shoulder, and told me I always had a great imagination. We said our goodbyes and she wished me luck for the future. As I don't have any civilian social media, that was the last time I heard from her. Why did I have that dream? Never again I experienced something like that, and to this day, I only have a vague idea about the potential why. But since then, I developed an interest in folklore, and I try to read a little about the many different spiritual worlds every night before I go to sleep. To me, these stories are completely true, and while they are deeply human, they also represent an entry point into the spirit world. A place where unseen forces help us shape good and evil in our lives, teach us important lessons, and more importantly, guide us into the future. That's why tonight I wanted to do something different and share this with you. Since I'm not Japanese, I hope I was able to do justice to their folklore, as to me it is one of the most interesting ones I have the pleasure of reading about. And more importantly, I hope you enjoy this journey too. I'm V and I've been your host for the night. Thank you so much for spending your time with me. Until we meet again.